Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'd just like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amber Khan. Dr. Amber Khan has devoted her medical training to Islamic health promotion and preventive medicine. She served as a health educator at several schools and community centers, as well as the chair of the education committee for the Islamic Medical Association of North America. Dr. Amber Khan also holds an associate's degree in Islamic studies from Mishka University, and she's led a weekly Youth Sisters Halaqah in Kenzan for the past 4 years. Please help me welcome Dr. Amber Khan.
Alhamdulillah wa salala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair ICD for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm going to pull up my screen and make sure that there we go, that my PowerPoint is good. And just wanted to see if I can make it a full screen. And I can also just flip through the slides as well. Abdurrahman, can you see a full screen there with my slides? Okay, Taib. I'll leave it as this and I'll click through the slides as we go along. So the topic for tonight was to discuss Khadijah bint Khuwaylid radiyallahu an. And it was narrated that, this is narrated by Ibn Abbas radiyallahu an, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he drew 4 lines in the ground and then he asked the Sahaba, do you know what this is? And they said, Allah and his messenger know best. And he alayhi salam, he said, the best of women of paradise are Khadijah bint Khuwaylid, Fatima bint Muhammad, Asiya bint Mazahim, the wife of Fir'aun, and Maryam bint Imran. May Allah be pleased with them all. Khadijah bint Khuwaylid radiyallahu an, she is considered to be one of the best women, and all of these women serve as a role model for both Muslim men and Muslim women. So tonight we will focus on Khadijah. Just want to preface that the resources for this talk, there is a wonderful series called The Mothers of the Believers, and there is a very extensive talk on Khadijah. It's about 4 hours long. If you would like more information, you can check that out. And also Sheikh Omar Suleiman, he does a really great series called The Firsts. And within that, he covers Khadijah and how she is the first of many, such as the first to embrace Islam, the first to pray, the first to be given the glad tidings of Jannah. So if you'd like more information, I recommend you check those out as well. So Khadijah, her name is very unique, just like Muhammad alayhi salam. And Khadijah, it means literally, the literal translation of Khadijah means premature. And we can presume that this means that she was born earlier than her due date. And scholars like to say that it was also meaning that she was very ahead of her time. She was well educated, she was literate, she was perfect in her behavior and her character, and she was very, and she also embodied self-dignity. Her nickname was Tahira, which means pure, and this was reflective of her character. She was known to not backbite or lie or upset others. She didn't use her position of authority to hurt others. She had a very subtle presence, and it was very atypical considering how much she had in comparison to the women in pre-Islamic Arabia. So what is Khadijah radiyallahu anha? What is her lineage? Khadijah was a pure Qurayshi. Her lineage actually links to the Prophet alayhi salam. Her parents and her grandparents were Qurayshi, and in the times of the Jahiliyyah, this was considered to be a big deal to come from the Quraysh. But she was not from Banu Hashim. That was the tribe of the Prophet ﷺ. She came from Banu Asad. Her father, Khuwaylid, was the leader of Banu Asad. And in fact, he had an older brother named Nawfal. And as we know, his son was Waraqa. Waraqa was the cousin of Khadijah. And we know from the story of the Seerah how he was considered to be a true Christian. And he advised the Prophet ﷺ after the revelation. Khuwaylid actually traveled with Mu'talib. They went together to protect the Kaaba, and they traveled to Yemen together. So there was a connection between the family of Khadijah and the Prophet ﷺ before, of course, their relationship. Khadijah had 3 brothers and 1 sister. One of her brothers was Awam. He was married to the Prophet ﷺ's aunt Safiya, and they had a son named Zubair. Zubair is one of the 10 promised Jannah, one of those who were promised Jannah. Her other brother was Hizam, who never became Muslim, but he had a child named Hakim, and he embraced Islam, and he became a very well-known Sahaba. Her youngest brother was Nawfal, and Nawfal became an enemy of Islam. The Quraysh used to call him the lion of the Quraysh, but the Muslims would refer to him as the shaitan of Quraysh. And he was killed in the Battle of Badr by Ali Radhilahan Attain. And lastly is her sister Hala, who many of us know about. Hala was the one who visited the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ, he recognized her footsteps outside of the door. It's reported that before she entered or called out, he just had this feeling that he knew that Hala was there. And he sat and he gifted her. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she reports and she says, my jealousy reached no limits, and I never felt more jealous than I did of Khadijah. And she blurted this out, and she was forgiven for this, but she said to Muhammad, out of her jealousy, she said, for how long will you remember an old woman of the Quraysh who died a long time ago, and Allah substituted someone better than her? And at this, the Prophet ﷺ, his face changed, and she could tell that that hurt him. And he, alayhi salam, he said, by Allah, Allah did not give me someone better than her. At this, she knew that it was inappropriate and considered to be disrespectful to her to talk about Khadijah in this way. Hala brought back many memories of Khadijah to him when he would see her. And this is a great, thing for us to remember, is that if someone who we love, such as a parent or a family member or relative, passes away, one of the advices of the Prophet ﷺ is to keep connections with relatives and friends of the deceased ones that you love. You may have nothing in common with them except the connection of that person who is no longer there. And a majority of your conversations, they will be about that deceased person. And we see this, the Prophet ﷺ, he would give gifts and meat to the friends of Khadijah. He, had no relationship with them except that they had this relationship together with Khadijah. Her first cousin of Waraqa, as we had mentioned, he is the one who the Prophet ﷺ and Khadijah go and speak to about when he is first encounters Jibreel alayhi salam. Waraqa is very well read. He is well traveled. He went to Byzantine, Jerusalem, Damascus. He can speak Hebrew, Aramaic, course, Arabic and Greek. And he accepted at first many versions of Christianity. We consider him to be a true Christian, believing in Isa alayhi salam as a prophet of Allah. But then he ended up rejecting all of the man-made changes to it and embraced the religion of Ibrahim. As we know, there were some in Mecca who were not pagan, but were monotheistic and were referred to as Hanif, or following the religion of Ibrahim, and Waraqa was of that. And then lastly is of a relative that we can be familiar with is her aunt Habiba. This aunt of Khadijah had a daughter named Bara, and Bara married Wahib, and they had Amina. And Amina, as we know, is the mother of the Prophet alayhi salam. So Khadijah's cousin is the grandmother of the Prophet alayhi salam. And what we find during that time, and was quite common, was intermarriages, especially amongst the Quraysh, that they wanted people within the tribe to marry each other in order to keep that pure lineage. And so the intermarriage that we see within their, between Khadijah and the Prophet alayhi salam is not something that was uncommon. What was Khadijah's life like before marrying the Prophet ﷺ? As we know, she was older than him. She was married before the Prophet ﷺ. Her first husband's name was Hind, and they had children together. And coincidentally, her son's name that they named was Hind as well. And her first husband, he was not from the Quraysh. He actually came from a tribe far away in Najd. And this husband passed away. It's reported that she married a second time from a man from Quraysh or from the Makhzum tribe, and there are differences of opinion on if they divorced or if he passed away. But regardless, Khadijah was a widow, or we can say a widow and a divorcee before meeting the Prophet alayhi salam. How did Khadijah radiallahu anh attain her wealth? Many of us know that she was very, very wealthy. Typically in that time, women did not get inheritance, especially if they had male relatives. In fact, if a woman's husband passed away, she was considered to be his property. And so therefore she would be inherited by one of his male relatives. They were considered to be, not capable of inheritance or even of earning wealth in that society. Typically, it was looked down upon, and it wasn't something that was very common. Of course, after Islam, this all changes. So in a society where women didn't acquire wealth, nor did they receive inheritance, how did Khadijah attain so much wealth? Her wealth did not come from her father or her personal family, her blood family. As mentioned, her first husband passed away, and he was not from the Quraysh. If he was, his money would have been returned back to the Quraysh tribe. He was from a tribe far away in Najd, and it would have been too difficult to have then passed that money all the way to Najd. He specifically came to Mecca to do business and selling and trading. He was a businessman, which is why he was in Mecca in the first place. So when her first husband dies, the money is not taken back to that tribe. Khadijah ends up keeping the money after he passes away, and she essentially inherits the business, and she becomes the wealthiest woman in Mecca. She was referred to as the princess of Mecca. Her caravan, it equaled all of the caravans of Quraysh. She had over 800 camels that would carry her goods. And she worked as a tradeswoman. She utilized this inheritance from her previous marriage to make more money through wisely investing in buying products and then hiring others to sell those products on her behalf. And the typical places where they would go and trade would be to travel to Syria and Yemen. A woman wouldn't travel in that circumstance. So in this case, she would hire people out to travel on her behalf. But despite this, she was not arrogant. She did not hoard her money. It's reported that she put a signifying factor on her house. It was known as like a green silk that covered her house. And it was not out of showiness, but it was to bring awareness to anyone who was dealing with poverty or was an orphan or a widow. And they could come to her house and she could help them financially. She would help them get married. She could even provide the meher on their behalf. And so she would use a lot of her money in that case to help others. Now, just a side note here is there are some who may say, family members or a husband or in-laws who may say, well, Khadijah worked, so Muslim women must work. You know, that if she is this great example and she is one of the best of women and she worked, then this signifies that women should work as well. Now, of course, women can work. It is their choice and they can do so. And the money that they earn is considered to be their own. But a woman in Islam that has no financial obligations. For Khadijah herself, her job entailed a passive income. She didn't work for anyone. She didn't have a set time, nor was her money really needed for her survival. She was truly empowered in her work. When it comes to the financial provisions for a female in Islam, this is a right in which it is her male relatives, such as her father before marriage, that is required upon them to fulfill this on her or provide for her. And once she gets married, this responsibility falls on her husband. And some may ask, well, why is it that a man is to provide or required to provide for his female relatives? And we have to look at it more from a global spectrum. We live in a very independent society, but globally, in some parts of the world, it's not always safe or possible for a woman to work. In addition, there are moments in a marital life in child rearing, where a woman will go through pregnancy or labor recovery or breastfeeding. And to do that, and these are, of course, biological things that only a woman can do. A man is never capable of this. And so for her to go through something as natural as that, and at the same time be required to provide for the family or provide 50-50 to the family, would be an injustice in that situation. So women are not financially obligated. That being said, when it comes to a marriage and a woman wants to work, or the couple mutually agree to both provide for the family, or if the woman decides, with the husband and the wife in that marriage, they decide together that she be the sole provider, then this is something in which marriage allows for that variability and flexibility. Sharia is law, but when it comes to spouses and both the husband and the wife want to provide for the family, and this is something they agree upon, and they're both satisfied, and their marriage flourishes because of this, no one's rights are being violated, then this is perfectly acceptable to do so. As long as there is an understanding that the woman is choosing this, and she can always change her mind. Any money that she gives to the family is considered to be a charity and a sadaqah, and that shows this true empowerment for women. And just to mention Sheikh Abdullah Jibreen, he said, the wife owns her wealth and she has the right to dispose of it. She may give it as gifts, give it in charity, pay off her debts, give up her rights to money that she is owed, or give up her rights to inheritance to whomever she wants, whether relatives or others. Her husband has no right to object if she is of mature and sound mind. Her husband does not have the right to dispose of any of her wealth except with her consent. This is just an important point to make clear, because many do tie this in with Khadijah and her business. Muslim women, as Khadijah was, are financially empowered in that we don't have to work, but we do have a right to be educated. And what we choose to do with that education is our choice as a full form of empowerment. We could have a full-time career, a part-time career. We can volunteer with our education. We can educate others with our education. We can advocate for social justice, or we can use this to provide for the second generation. This does not just apply to women who have children. A woman's value is not bound to conception and motherhood. Many pious women bore no children, including Aisha, whose massive intellectual contributions we are all indebted to. This also doesn't apply to married women. Some of history's most pious women never married, and they are great examples to us as well, such as Asiya. And even for Muslim men as well, many of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, they had very simple jobs, and they spent their lives traveling and spreading knowledge to others. So as Muslims, our education is not connected to our career. It is a basic human right. So going back and continuing on, how did Khadijah radiallahu anha meet the Prophet alayhi salam? Because of Khadijah's kindness, she was often taken advantage of. For example, when she would employ traders, to travel on her behalf to Syria or to Yemen, she noticed that when they would come back, they would come up short. And she knew from the numbers that she was being cheated. She suffered losses. They would lie, they would pocket her money, and they simply took advantage of her. She was looking at this point for an honest merchant. So how did the Prophet ﷺ come up in the conversation? The Prophet ﷺ was not a merchant. He was a shepherd. As the prophets of Allah are typically, all of the prophets of Allah as ordained by Allah are considered to be, or were shepherds, as a way to teach them how to take care of their flock. So the Prophet ﷺ, he shepherded Abu Talib's sheep. But he also became a broker. He engaged in trading on behalf of a seller, but he himself did not travel to Syria or Yemen. So Khadijah, she was complaining to her sister Hala about the traders she was hiring and how they were cheating and taking advantage of her. And Hala said that, I know a shepherd. He takes care of my sheep. He's trustworthy. You can ask his uncle to perhaps be a trader for you. So she asks, and Abu Talib accepts, and Muhammad alayhi salam, he accepts as well. So he takes her caravan for that year, and he is paired with Maysara, and Maysara, who is one of the servants of Khadijah radiallahu anha. He attests to the Prophet ﷺ's good character. He was honest and he was noble in his business. The amount sold and the amount of money that he returned, it was identical. He didn't pocket any of her money. And so this Khadijah found was a very noble and rare quality from what she had seen. Now, Khadijah was single at this time, of course, and Muhammad alayhi salam was also single. Why was Muhammad alayhi salam single? He simply did not have the financial means to provide for a family. He felt indebted to Abu Talib. And why was Khadijah single? She was proposed many times. Abu Jahl proposed to her, Abu Sufyan proposed to her, Uqba proposed to her. But these men were not the type of character that she was looking for. These men, they were arrogant, they were polytheists, they were untrustworthy with her money. Their intention for why they wanted to marry was something in which, there was a fear of. So, this was a time in which people typically didn't turn down proposals, but she was unlike any other women. So when she saw the Prophet ﷺ, she noticed a quality that she hadn't typically seen in another person. So she said to her friend Nafisa, Muhammad ﷺ, he seems like a good man. And that, in that he had character, right? She wasn't looking for wealth or power or lineage. She was looking for good character. And she found that in someone. So Nafisa said, I can talk to him. And Khadijah said, okay, but do not mention my name. So Nafisa said to the Prophet ﷺ, why don't you get married with someone who has a good lineage or good wealth? And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, who will marry me? I'm an orphan. I don't have much wealth. Right? He thought he had nothing, he wasn't good enough. So she said, I could find you someone. And he said, who do you have in mind? And she said, I have in mind Khadijah. And he he said, why would she be interested in me? Like, what would I have to offer her? This woman with everything? I mean, how could I even think that I could be with her? So he didn't say he wasn't interested. He simply just thought he wasn't good enough. So Nafisa alayhi salam, she returned back to Khadijah, and then it was mentioned of the proposal. The Prophet alayhi salam, he consulted Abu Talib and also his uncle Hamza as well as Abbas, and they all said, you should marry her. She is the greatest woman to marry. You should not bypass this. And so he agreed upon the marriage, and Waraqa conducted the marriage. So yes, she did initiate the marriage. She did use an intermediary. And this is a great example for both brothers and sisters that when you meet someone with good character and with good Islam, don't sit on that. That is a rare quality, especially in today's time. You have the ability to and the right to propose or to inquire and to get to know that person. And if you notice good character and good Islam, this is something in which we should protect ourselves from walking away from. How old was Khadijah when she married the Prophet ﷺ? This is the Prophet ﷺ's first marriage, and it's reported that he was 25 years old. Ibn Ishaq, which has the most authentic book of Sirah, it doesn't mention Khadijah's age. It is mentioned in Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, and it mentions the most common report that she was 40 when they got married. So she's 15 years older than the Prophet ﷺ. However, it's important to mention that there's another narration that states she was 28. So still older than the Prophet ﷺ, but not by as much as has been mentioned in other narrations. So Allah knows best in this regard. But what is most important to note here, there's a lot of talk about their age gap because it's very unusual in today's time. But what's even more so a bigger deal than this age gap is you look at a man who has never been married before, who is a virgin, and he chooses to marry, and she proposes, and he chooses to marry someone who is a widow, someone who is divorced, someone who had kids from a previous marriage, a woman who is successful, a woman who is much wealthier than him, and also, yes, she is older than him, whether it be a few years or several years. This is actually what stands out the most when you really look at it. And when you think about marriages today and women who are divorced or widowed, the amount of stigma that they have from the community and how difficult they struggle with to get married, and how some who are really in tumultuous marriages will stay in those marriages out of fear of the stigma that, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no such stigma like this. The underlying message when it comes to marrying in Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that he whom you appeal his character and religion came to propose for marriage, so let him marry. If otherwise, it will lead to great corruption and temptation upon earth. This hadith, it mentions two qualities that we are to look for in a spouse, and that is character and religion. Our outer beauty, it's nothing but a container that holds who you really are. And on the day of judgment, your khulaq, your character, is going to weigh the most on the day of judgment. It's your strength in your ethics, your knowledge, your good attitude. This is what will benefit you in this world and the hereafter. And so to find someone who can help you alongside that and build your good character is someone worth considering for marriage. So now with this marriage, now the Prophet ﷺ, he had good character. We know this before meeting Khadijah. And, he had a good position in society with this character, right? This is what made her want to marry him, that this was his natural disposition. But the marriage, it gave him access to much more. With her status and with her money, he was able to have a bigger role in society, and it gave him access to elites, such as many of us know about the story of placing the black stone. So we can see that this marriage is starting to set things up for the wahi coming down. His relationship with the society is now changed because of this marriage. Who lived with them during or after they got married? So after they got married, the Prophet ﷺ moved into her house. Before that, he was living with Abu Talib. And who lived with them after was Abu Qasim. Were their children. And the first one was Al-Qasim. I'm sorry, it says Abu Qasim. It's Al-Qasim, who passes away before the wahi. Next is Zainab. Zainab, she actually married Hal's son, Abu As. And Zainab, she is the one who sends Khadijah's necklace to ransom her husband during the Battle of Badr. This is that story. Ruqayya is the one who later married Uthman, and she became very ill. And this is the reason why Uthman did not participate in the Battle of Badr, because the Prophet ﷺ specifically told him to stay with Ruqayya, and she did pass away during that battle. Kulthum, she also later on married Uthman. So Uthman is of the Sahaba who married two of the children of the Prophet ﷺ, and she also passed away shortly after their marriage. Fatima, she married Ali, and she in the second year of the Hijrah. And lastly is Abdullah. He was the only one to be born in Islam, and he dies in Mecca, and he's the one who Surah Al-Kawthar is revealed from. Her previous children were also in the household as well, such as Hind. Ali also joins them in their household. The Prophet ﷺ, he has now more money due to Khadijah. Abu Talib is very poor, so the Prophet ﷺ agrees to raise Ali in his house. Khadijah also later on will have a slave known Zayd bin Haritha, who she gifts to the Prophet ﷺ and who he frees and later on becomes his adopted son. So it was a full house. All of these people living together for 15 years before the wahi comes down. There is not that much information about this household because this is before prophethood, and it is usually a personal and private, family life. So now at this point, the wahi comes down. And what was Khadijah's reaction when the wahi came down? A few months before the verses of Surah Iqra were revealed, the Prophet ﷺ, he starts confiding in Khadijah that there are things that are changing in him. He says, I'm seeing dreams and then they're coming true. And we know this in Bukhari, that he said that he had these dreams that would turn into reality for about 6 months before the wahi actually comes down. And she would say to him about this, that this is good news, for nothing will happen to you except good. She truly, affirmed his good character and couldn't imagine, Allah doing something bad to him because of that good character, which is a great example for us to remember our good character and to instill that in ourselves, that if you have good character, that any hardships that come your way, inshallah, they will build you up, they will make you better, and with the right attitude, inshallah, you will overcome that. He also would prefer to seclude himself. She Radhilahan Attain Khadijah, she said that Allah put the love of seclusion in the heart of the Prophet. He preferred to stay in Mount Hira, which is actually about 1.5 to 2 hour walk away from where they lived. And so he would travel about almost 2 hours away, and he would stay there, and he would worship, Allah knows best, in a Hanif way, in worshiping one Allah or one God. And he would stay there sometimes for a few days or weeks or even a month. She very much supported this. And this is before his prophethood, right? She doesn't know this is coming down. This is just prior to that. And so she very much supports that this is something that he needs to do. This is something in which within him, is something that he feels that he has to do. She would bring him food. And some of the women in that society, they would mock her for this. And they say, where is your husband going for so long? But she had so much trust that she felt that if he was doing something that was beneficial for him, that she respected that. And she gave him space to fulfill that. And I think it's important to note also that he earned that trust. Right? He proved to her that he could be someone she could trust. And so because of that give and take, she very much trusted him and knew that he wasn't taking advantage of her, or he wasn't saying he was going somewhere and not elsewhere. He recognized this very much in her. And he, alayhi salam, used to say, she supported me when no one else did. And then at this one time in the seclusion, it is when, of course, Jibreel alayhi salam comes down. Jibreel alayhi salam, after he embraces Muhammad, he becomes a prophet of Allah. He finds out that this is his message to spread La ilaha illallah, and the Prophet alayhi salam was terrified. It was a minimum of about a 1.5 to 2 hour walk from that encounter to going home. And rather than stopping at Abu Bakr's house or Abu Talib's house or Hamza's house, he needs to rush home. He needs to be with Khadijah. And so it is when he comes to Khadijah and he finally comes home that he's able to calm down and to feel safe. It's reported in Ibn Hisham that he sat next to her thigh to thigh, very close, and he embraced her. He needed her physical comfort. And in Bukhari, it's reported that his heart was trembling and he was saying to her, cover me, cover me. And she comforts him. And Aisha radhiallahu anha, and she narrates that his trepidation and his fear left him after he received her comfort. She didn't ask any questions. The hadith says that there was a time where they didn't speak for some time, that she waited. And it was then when he confides in her and he says, I'm worried about myself. The one who I saw in my sleep, I saw in real life. And then he said, am I going crazy? Am I possessed? He's very vulnerable in this state and he needs some reassurance. And so he turns to the one who can be the most vulnerable too. And for some of us, we may not have that person, despite having a family or a spouse or parents, that sometimes we feel like we don't have a person that we can trust. And so it's not a guarantee that once you become married that you have that, or if you have a family that you have that. That's something that has to be earned. And he very much had that with her. And this is proven by her response, that when he said this to her, she said, and this is mentioned in Bukhari, the first thing she said was that she negates his doubts and affirms his status. She said, this is good news. Don't be sad. Allah will never disgrace you. He needed to hear that he was not crazy. And she did more so than that. She said, this is good news. Allah would never disgrace you. And then she started to list his positive qualities. You are a good family. You are good to your family. You're good to your relatives. You help the weak. You give to those who have nothing. You're hospitable to guests. You help in every positive manner. It's also mentioned, you speak the truth. Your truth is always fulfilled, or your trusts are always fulfilled. Your akhlaq, it's not better than others. This is someone who, if your spouse can attest to your good character, then you don't need any other proof. We usually take advantage of the people who are closest to us because, there is that unconditional love that we know that they'll forgive us. So they usually see the worst of us. But the Khadijah, she is acknowledging the best in him. And when you have a spouse or a family, your parents who can, attest to your good character, this truly means more than any other person could say. And then she also mentions that she had a very positive understanding of Allah. She said, Allah blesses the righteous, and I don't know anyone more righteous than you. She doesn't just stop at giving him these positive affirmations, but then she goes into action and she says, let's go to my cousin Waraqah. He's well-knowledged. He knows about the previous prophets, and let's ask him. She is truly embodying that hadith of ask the people of knowledge if you don't know. They go to Waraqa and he then tells him, you are a prophet of Allah. The people are going to fight you. And if I live to that time, then I will fight with you. Just a side note here is, why were there no female prophets? Now, when you think about the way that women were treated in all societies, not just in the Jahiliyyah period, but outside of Arabia, when you look at the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, if you look in the Greek civilization, if you look at any other society in the world, regardless of their religion or their race, they all collectively looked at women in the same way, which was to treat them as a second-class citizen. So to expect a woman to become a prophet of Allah and to spread this message of La ilaha illallah, who would believe her? Women came with other issues to the public. This person assaulted me. This person is cheating me in my business, or this person did this or that. They disbelieved in her. They called her a liar. They would call her a witch. They would outlaw her. They would kill her. So to think that you could give the message of La ilaha illallah in those types of societies with the poor mindset that they had of women, it would have been a grave injustice. When we look at the male prophets, even they themselves, many, they were persecuted. They were their character assassinated. Some of them were killed. So Allah instilled women to have other roles in serving the message. And these four best women that we mentioned in the beginning, they were all connected to a prophet. Maryam radiallahu anha, she was the mother of Isa alayhi salam. Asiya was the adoptive mother of Musa. Khadijah is the wife of Rasulullah, and Fatima is the daughter of a prophet. They supported and they nurtured these prophets. They lifted their spirits and they affirmed their resolve to make their dawah easy for them. The Prophet ﷺ, he used to say about Khadijah that Allah has given a risk of her love. He referred to her love as his sustenance, which is why Allah put these women in, the Prophet's lives. As Ibn Hisaq, he says, Khadijah believed in him and affirmed what had been sent to him by Allah, and she supported him in his affairs, and she was the first who ever believed in Allah and his messenger and believed in what was revealed to him. She is the first Muslimah in human history. So through her, Allah made it easy upon his prophet. Never would he hear anything of his people rejecting him or refuting him and become grieved, except that worry and grief would be removed when he returned to her. For she would comfort him and affirm him and make it easy for him, and thus make the troubles that the people gave him, she would make it disappear and easy for him. Next is, now that he is a prophet of Allah, how did those 10 years of dawah, how did she endure those 10 years until she passed away? Now, after meeting Jibreel alayhi salam, months went by and no more wahi came down. There's this break. And she continued to reassure him. And then finally, Angel Jibreel comes, and this time he comes in his angelic form, which is terrifying, as is this description. He took up the span of from one side of the horizon to the other. He came with hundreds of wings. And again, he runs to no one else except to Khadijah. And it says the same thing, cover me, cover me. And she knows what happened. Oh, the revelation came down. He saw Jibreel alayhi salam, Surah Mudaththir. Surah Mudaththir, it comes revealed. And while he's in her arms, this surah is revealed. The first verses of it are revealed. And it says, oh, you wrapped up in Khadijah, arise and warn about your Lord. After this, the Prophet ﷺ, he said to her, you are the first that I am going to call the message to. And she said, I am the first one to accept this message. No hesitation, pure conviction. She was the first Muslim to embrace Islam. After this, their relationship that they had was drastically changed from one of a blissful and peaceful marriage to now full of tribulations and trials and tests, but not in their marriage. It still made their marriage very strong, if not stronger, because they were able to be together during those struggles. In those 10 years, She sold her clothes. It's reported that she sold her jewelry in order to spend in the cause of Allah. She had to witness character assassination, of hearing the tarnishing of the character of the Prophet ﷺ. She also heard about the character assassination of even her daughters. For example, Ruqayya and Kulthum, that before Islam, they were betrothed to the sons of Abu Lahab. And then after the revelation comes down, he brought shame onto the daughters and would speak ill of them. And she had to endure hearing this of her own children. The most painful was the boycott. When the boycott took place, the Quraysh said that they are not going to sell any food or water to Banu Hashim and Banu Muttalib. They were included in the boycott, and so they had to live outside of the city. This happened for about 2 to 3 years. Now, Khadijah is not from Banu Hashim. She did not need to participate in the boycott, but she insisted on staying with the Prophet ﷺ. The boycott was extremely arduous. They were forced to eat leaves and grass. There was one Sahaba, it's reported that he found leather from an animal and he boiled it and he drank it for days. Now, she had a connection, her nephew Hakim, who at the time was not Muslim yet, and he would sneak in food for her, but she wouldn't eat it. She would donate it to the others in the boycott as well, and she instead would eat grass. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ can imagine looking at her at this point. You know, this is reported she was in her 60s. She's losing weight. She's becoming very sick. But she was very selfless and she never complained. And, you know, why is this happening? Why did you do this to me? This was not her attitude. When you look at some of the wives of the other prophets, like Prophet Lut alayhi salam, or the wife of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, that not all family around the prophets were supportive. Not all of them were support systems. Some of them were, very much made their dawah very difficult. But Khadijah was an example of one who fully supported her husband. And then we move to the death of Khadijah. The years of the boycott took a very severe toll on Khadijah. The food was scarce. They lived in tents. It was a very harsh living. And in the 10 years of dawah, the boycott was lifted in the 10th year of the dawah. And the Muslims moved back to Mecca. But shortly after, in the month of Ramadan, Khadijah becomes ill and sick. It's at this time when Jibreel alayhi salam, he comes to the Prophet. This is reported in Bukhari, that Jibreel came to the Prophet alayhi salam and he said, Khadijah is going to come with some food. And when she comes, tell her that Allah says salam to her. This is the first for Allah to say salam to someone. And give Khadijah my salam too. And give her the glad tidings of a house of Jannah made out of qasab, which is the outer layer of a pearl, and that there will be no loud noise or tiredness. Sulahili, he reports here that Khadijah gave away her jewelry, and so this is the mention of the qasab and the loud noise and tiredness of the character assassination, that this is to, mention the eternal tranquility that she will receive. Khadijah was the first to be given salam by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She was the first to be promised Jannah. And when Khadijah walks in, the Prophet ﷺ, he tells her this, and her reaction is that she smiles, and Nasa'i reports that she said, Allah is the source of salam, and to Jibreel my salam, and upon you, O Messenger, O the Messenger, salam. She added the Prophet ﷺ to her response. Now, Ibn Hajar, he says that her response, it demonstrates the superiority of her intellect, that she knows that you cannot give salam to the one who is salam, who is as-salam. So she says, Allah is the source of salam. You can really see the instinctive tawheed that Khadijah had, that even later on the companions, when it was reported to pray, they didn't know how to praise Allah. And this is when they were taught the tashahhud, so they could learn how to praise Allah. But for Khadijah, it was instinctual. And the Prophet ﷺ, he used to say about her that she has perfected her faith. And this is great proof of that. This was also a sign that her life was coming to an end. And Ibn Hajar says that she passed away in the year 620 in this month of Ramadan. And it's also reported that Abu Talib passed away in Ramadan as well this same year, or in Sha'ban, whether it was a few days or a few weeks difference. It's reported that she was, and Allah knows best, 65 years old. The Prophet ﷺ was 50 years old. They were married for 25 years in a monogamous relationship, and this was very odd and very rare in that time to be in a monogamous relationship. Everyone was a part of a polygamous relationship. There was no restrictions or conditions, of course, at this time that were set on polygyny or polygamy. But the Prophet ﷺ, he wanted to show his gratitude towards her. You know, she was the one, it was her finances. She was the one supporting her. It would not be, to be able to repay that generosity in marrying someone else, and the amount of support and love that she had, that she gave him, was sufficient for him. It wasn't until Medina, where he had his own income, he was a leader, there was no persecution, he had the upper hand, and he married for the purpose of social legislation, marrying those who were divorced, or for those who were widowed, for those to free the slaves. And so you see the difference in the relationship that he had with his wives in Medina in comparison to that with Khadijah. She was buried in a Meccan graveyard. The Prophet ﷺ buried her with his own hands. At that time, the janazah was not legislated. And Hakim, he narrates that Khadijah died in the 10th year of Ramadan. We took her from her house to the grave site, and the Prophet ﷺ descended into her grave and put her in, and he covered her up. And this was 3 years before the Hijrah, and it was shortly after the boycott. At this, the Prophet ﷺ, he lost his support. His problems that normally seemed to resolve when she was alive, they started to pile up. And Abu Talib was his help on the outside. Khadijah was his help on the inside. And it was for this reason why that entire year after the passing, that it was known as the year of sorrow. It's reported that people didn't see him smile for that entire year. Some feared for the Prophet ﷺ after her death, that he would soon die due to his grief. They would leave him alone. They would ask things out of fear that it would hurt him. They didn't want to burden him with their own troubles about being Muslim, because he was in a very delicate state. It was reported that they would hear him crying in his home and being comforted by Fatima. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "She believed in me when no one else did. She accepted Islam when people rejected me, and she helped and comforted me when there was no one else to lend me a helping hand." This, just to close here, is just a great example of a relationship that really shows mature love, that this isn't Hollywood love or movie love. This is a mature and real love in which two people who truly respect the character of the other and rely on each other and feel that they can be vulnerable with each other, knowing that they will not be shamed or ridiculed. And no matter what, adversity or what tests that they go through, that they will be there and support each other. This is the Prophet ﷺ crying when seeing Khadijah's necklace years after her passing. It shows that, when you meet a good person with good character, and especially for that person to become your spouse, that you pray that you will get to be with this person in eternity forever, yet you miss very much for their time while you are still on this earth. Narrated by Ali, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, "Mary, the daughter of Imran, was the best among the women of the world of her time, and Khadijah is the best amongst the women of this nation." May Allah bless her, and may we find benefit from the lessons in this story. May we emulate her character in our own relationships as well. And may Allah allow us to love Islam and live our lives in His remembrance. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah.